as a substitute for Judaism, a replacement for Judaism, and a way to negate Judaism.
Yeah, so that takes us to our first question. What is a Jew?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a question that Zionists are unable to answer because they negated the real definition. When I say the real definition, I mean the only intellectually consistent one. Let's first start with what a Jew is not. A Jew is not a race. There are Jews of all races. There are black Jews and white Jews, brown Jews. A Jew is not an ethnicity. There are Jews of all sorts of ethnicities. Makes no sense to say that the Ethiopian Jews and the Yemenite Jews are of the same ethnicity as the German and Russian Jews. It also makes no sense to say that you can convert to an ethnicity even though you can convert to Judaism. It will be difficult to believe that Ivanka Trump and Sammy Davis Jr., who claims to have converted to Judaism, are both of the same ethnicity, right?
I don't know. I often confuse them.
A lot of people are confused when they talk about the Zionist definition of Judaism. So you have a lot of company there. There are real converts to Judaism. King David came from an ethnic Moabite family. Ruth converted to Judaism, and King David is her great-great-grandson. You can't convert to an ethnicity. In addition, by Jewish law, if your father is not Jewish and your mother is Jewish, you are 100% Jewish. That doesn't follow the DNA rules of ethnicity. Ethnicity depends on your ancestry and your culture and things like that. But Judaism does not. There are actual, very precise rules and guidelines as to what constitutes a Jew and what does not. And this has been upheld for thousands of years. Jews are also not a nationality. Jews have had no national characteristics, meaning we've had no common land, language, or culture. For thousands of years, the Jews had no flag. Jews had no national anthem. Jews didn't even have a national symbol. The Star of David wasn't a national symbol of Jews. It's a Kabbalistic symbol. It represents certain concepts in Judaism, but it's not the symbol of our religion. I mean, it has no holiness in it. You're allowed to throw it on the floor or in the garbage or something like that. It's not considered a Jewish holy object or a Jewish holy symbol. The definition of a Jew is it's a religion, but there are non-religious Jews. That's true, and the reason for that is because every religion has its rules, and the rule of Judaism says that when God gave the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai, whoever the Torah at that point required to fulfill the law of God, the 613 commandments, that by definition means you're a Jew. If you weren't obligated by that revelation to fulfill the 613 commandments, you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. Gentiles are obligated to fulfill 7 commandments, Jews 613. Whoever is obligated to fulfill the 613 is considered a Jew, whether they believe that or not. Now, there are Jews in good standing, Jews in bad standing, there are traitorous Jews, there are treacherous Jews, but a Jew who is born, he is a Jew if he is obligated to fulfill the 613 commandments. So if you really want to be precise, being a Jew in the most accurate way to describe it is a job description given by God. God said you are deputized into this religion, you are obligated to fulfill these commandments, whether you do them or not. The obligation, the job description, defines you as a Jew. Now, there are all sorts of legal questions that we have regarding very precise, very, very precise laws as to what's considered a convert. You can convert into Judaism. You cannot convert out of Judaism. If a pregnant woman converts, her child is considered Jewish when it's born. It's a question. It's a disagreement amongst Jewish scholars whether the child is considered a convert, having converted together with the mother, or is it considered born Jewish because the mother converted before the baby was born? It's a question in our legal scholars. It's a disagreement. The difference is because if a child is converted when he's a minor, when he comes of age, he has the ability to renounce his conversion and say, I don't want to be Jewish. If you're born Jewish, you don't have that right. If a woman is converted while she's pregnant and she has a baby, when that baby becomes of age, bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah, is that baby now, who's an adult, allowed to renounce their Judaism? Is it considered born Jewish or converted? So these are questions.
Zionists would be like, they are Jewish if they can shoot a gun.
Well, you know what? That was actually Jabotinsky kind of sort of hinted at that. You know the quote? He says, as far as what we need to teach our children is how to shoot, you know? Now, the Zionists didn't want this definition of Jew. The Zionists, I'll give you a little quick history of how Zionism came into existence. They looked at Jews the same way the anti-Semites did. These were assimilated Jews, non-religious Jews, who looked at Jews as disgusting, immoral, weak, ugly, cowardly. And all the types of stereotypes that you find amongst the anti-Semites, you find in the original early Zionist writings. Their first solution was to assimilate. Theodor Herzl, who was one of these people who really didn't like Jews, he had an idea to convert all Jews to Christianity. He wrote about it in his diary. There was this fantasy he had where all the Jews are going to line up one Sunday afternoon, I believe it was Sunday if I remember right, and go to church and be baptized and convert, except Herzl himself is going to be the last Jew. And then there won't be any more anti-Semitism, and not only that, but Jews will forget that they're Jews. They won't be Jews anymore, and they will live happily ever after. Anti-Semitism was attributed to the faults of the Jews, besides the anti-Semites' own inadequacies. They figured that if you change the Jews, the anti-Semites won't hate them anymore. So basically, the Zionist plan was to change to end anti-Semitism by changing Semitism as far as Jews are concerned, by eliminating that. The problem with the original plan, assimilation, is that it didn't work. In the late 1800s, there were pogroms, primarily in Russia, which showed the Zionists, or the assimilated Jews actually, that assimilated Jews are still Jews and they're still hated. But now that's where the identity crisis comes in. The subtitle of my book is Zionism's Journey from Identity Crisis to Identity Theft. The Zionists didn't understand this. They were thinking, why do people hate us if we're just like the Gentiles? We're just regular Russians. Why do they look at us as Jews? That's a very good question. I once asked an anti-Semite, a real famous, I don't want to say his name, real famous anti-Semite, how do you decide who's a Jew? He says, well, whoever identifies as a Jew is Jewish. Now,
was it Netanyahu?
Very good. No. Netanyahu would have had another answer, although I do consider him an anti-Semite. The Zionists had said to themselves, hey, we don't want to be Jews, but the Gentiles won't let us be Gentiles. So what are we? That was the identity crisis. And many scholars have used that phrase in various contexts. It was an identity crisis. So they came up with what I call identity theft. We're going to change the definition of Jew. Nationalism was just starting in those days. This was the 1800s. It was the Balkan people and others. Nation states started being formed in those days. And they said, hey, nationalism worked for so many people, let it work for the Jews as well. So we're going to change the definition of Jew to a nationality. Until the Zionists, nobody looked at the Jews as a nationality. There was maybe Spinoza was a quirky exception, which is one of the reasons he was excommunicated, because he just wanted to change the definition of Jew, but nobody really followed any of this stuff. There were early Zionists like Moses Hess and even Emma Lazarus, who wrote that poem on the Statue of Liberty. She was a Zionist too. There were pre-Herzlian Zionists who believed this, but it was just started in the 1800s. And that was the plan. So the plan was to change the definition of a Jew to a nationality. And the idea was that once the Jews change their definition, the way they look at themselves, the world will change the way they look at the Jews as well. The Jews will also, by changing the way they look at themselves, change their personalities, change their ideology, change the way they act, the way they behave, and change their aspirations and their values. Whereas previously, Jews were, as the Bible describes it, Mamleches Kaihanim V'Goy Kodosh, which means a people who are enjoined by God to fulfill this religion. Think Shaolin temples, that type of thing, except instead of a mountaintop, they were in ghettos. And the Jews themselves, about 1,000 years ago, were the ones that suggested they live in ghettos. They wanted to be separate, socially and culturally separate from the rest of society, loyal to the countries that they live, absolutely, but culturally and socially separate, because we have our own laws, we have our own lifestyle, and they were. There were assimilated Jews that didn't like that, and when they had a chance to break out of the ghetto, they did, thinking, as I mentioned, that assimilation is going to end anti-Semitism and they're going to be like everybody else. When they saw that didn't work, then they tried nationalism. Nationalism is another name for Zionism, Jewish nationalism. That's all Zionism is. But the thing to know about Zionism is that whereas the Kurds, for example, look at themselves as a nationality and they're trying to find a state, right? The Jews never did. The Zionists had to convince the Jews that you are not what you think you are. You are not the Mamleches Kaihanim V'Goy Kodosh. You are not a people who are enjoined by God to fulfill this religion, these religious laws. You are a nation. You need a language. You need a flag. You need a country. Because Jews didn't share a language for 2,000 years. More than for thousands of years we hadn't spoken Hebrew. In biblical times they did, but that wasn't the national language of the Jewish people, meaning that's not what united us into being a people. The only thing that united us into being a people is our Torah, our faith. It was so well known that this quote that we are only a people because of our faith, it's over 1,000 years old, and it was like the meme of Jewish identity. Even Theodore Herzl mentions it in his diary. Everybody knew that. The Zionists had to change that. And because Jews had no flag, they had no common language, culture, or land, the Zionists had to provide them with it. The Zionists set out to synthesize a new nationality. But instead of creating a new nationality out of nothing, Herzl stand and we'll call
like
ourselves
the Canism that you refer to.
The Canaanim, yes.
Yeah.
So, yes, very good. There was this small group of kind of like Zionists called the Canaanim that decided to create a new nation. The Canaan is named after the people who were occupying, who were living in the Holy Land before Joshua came in there and conquered it. And they decided, okay, we're gonna make a new nationality. We're the Canaanim. It didn't never hit it off, because why would anybody identify with that? So the Zionists, Theodore Herzl mostly had this brilliant idea. You know, if you want to if you want to change your identity, a witness protection program or something, you can get the government to give you a whole new identity, and that'll work. But there's a lot of resources and time and effort spent to create such. There's another way to do it that's easier. Kill somebody that's around your age, steal his papers, steal his birth certificate, steal his license, steal his identity, and you're him. That's what the Zionists did to the Jews collectively. We're going to erase Jewish identity. We're going to take their history, change it a bit. We're going to take their identity. We're going to take their self-image. We're going to take Jewishness, and we're going to make it into Zionism. We're going to get the Jews a flag. There was a Zionist flag before there was a state of Israel. We're going to get the Jews a language. There was a Zionist language. Modern Hebrew was created by the Zionists before there was a state of Israel, because they wanted to supply the Jews with national characteristics, national symptoms, national equipment. And the hardest part was the country. They stole Jewish history. They revised all of Jewish history. They had this nonsense that Jews for thousands of years were looking for national self-determination, which is not true. We were looking for a messianic renewal of the world. Zionists will tell you, it's so funny how they do this. They'll tell you how Jews always for thousands of years would say at the end of the Passover Seder, next year in Jerusalem.
Yes, we hear this all the time.
Yeah, so let me tell you a secret that they're not telling you. Today, the Jews in Jerusalem also say that. So if you're sitting in Jerusalem, yes, and you have a Passover Seder, you end it by saying next year in Jerusalem. Now, the reason for that is that the Jerusalem that we are in context of our prayers praying for and hoping for and asking for is not a Jerusalem that we have today. It's a Jerusalem that's governed by a resurrected King David, resurrected from the dead, with God's revelation, the revelation of God's oneness and holiness revealed to the entire world, where the wolf lays down with the lamb. It's that Jerusalem that we're looking for, okay? Yes, the city is Jerusalem, but it's empty today. It's kind of like a husk of the real Jerusalem. It has a certain amount of holiness, certainly, but it's not King David's Jerusalem. The throne of David is not there. The Messiah is not there. That's what we were looking for. They emptied Judaism of religious content, left the husk of whatever they could fit into their nationalism, and then they redid history, redid ideology, and just started creating cultural centers and schools and an entirely new, it was a social engineering project. But one thing they were unable to steal, and that's the definition of a Jew. Considering what the definition of a Jew is, it depends on Torah law. Whoever the Torah says is obligated in the commandments is a Jew. So now, how are the Zionists going to define a Jew? You see, we have these precise laws. If your father's Jewish and your mother's not, you're not Jewish. If your mother's Jewish and your father is not, you are Jewish. If you convert, you're Jewish. And conversion means to accept these 613 commandments. And once you convert to Judaism, you cannot convert out of Judaism. So how are they going to define Jew? So they didn't really bother because they can't. It's like I wrote in my book. It's like trying to figure out what 2 plus 2 is without recognizing the number 4. 4 doesn't exist. Now let's figure out 2 plus 2. It was impossible. They couldn't do it. Jews aren't a race, although Jabotinsky said Jews are a race. It didn't make any sense. Jews are not a tribe. We have no head of a tribe. There's no infrastructure of a tribe. Whoever heard of this tribe? We actually consist of 12 tribes in biblical times, and now most people don't even know which tribes they come from, although it's mostly 2 of them. But we're not a tribe, we're not a nationality, we don't fit any of those things. Here's a question. If Jews are anything but a religion, can you have Christian Jews? Can a Jew practice Christianity? If a Jew is an ethnicity, so why can't he practice Christianity? Why can't we have Muslim Jews? Now, actually, the Zionists, the early Zionists, debated this and they were banging their heads against the wall trying to figure out a solution to this dilemma. How are we going to define Jew? And there was a great disagreement between them whether or not you actually could have Muslim Jews, Christian Jews. Israel Zangwill said that when Jews get a state, so the Holy Sepulchre will be guarded by Jews that are Christians, and the Omar Mosque by Jews who are Muslims. Others said, no, we don't like that. But they never really answered the question until they couldn't kick the can down the road anymore. The problem is they wrote a law of return, which means that Jews have a right to come to Israel and become citizens. Okay, now it's a legal category, Jew. Now you have to legally define it. Are you going to follow the religious definition? Well, you're not a religious country. You're not following the religion. You don't. In fact, the Zionists, they refused even to mention the word God in their Declaration of Independence.
They probably knew he'd be pretty upset.
Yeah, absolutely. the Knesset got together and decided basically that, well, if you're born Jewish, you're Jewish. Well, according to whose definition, that still hasn't been exactly decided to this day. But if you're born Jewish, you're Jewish. They did have a chief rabbinate, and they kind of left the status quo that we're going to follow the religious definition. But if you practice another religion like Christianity, this is today's Israeli law, then you're not entitled to the law of return. Or if you're born a Jew and you're Jews for Jesus, or you practice Islam, you, let's say, converted to Islam, but you were born Jewish, you're not considered a Jew. But if you were born Jewish and you're an atheist, you are a Jew.
Zionists don't believe in God, but they believe that he gave them the land, sort of thing.
Yeah, there are people that say that, exactly. So now here's the problem. You see, without Judaism, what value is the Holy Land? The Holy Land is the Holy Land. That's what it is to us, a holy land. It's not a national homeland. The Torah
got a lot of nice beaches, I think, is the appeal.
Being an Orthodox Jew, I would not know. But I can tell you it has a lot of the Holy Land are not exactly the borders of Israel. The southern town Eilat is not part of our Holy Land. And southern Lebanon, somewhere south of Beirut, is the Holy Land.
The occupation is kind of confused about the concept of borders, right? They're not the best to ask about that.
They couldn't even decide whether they wanted the Holy Land or somewhere else. You know, they had the Uganda plan, they had other things. And Theodor Herzl, who was the masterminds behind Zionism, he said, no, listen, guys, we want the Holy Land because, remember, this is like identity theft. He didn't use these words. I'm paraphrasing, of course. He said, for marketing purposes, we need to get the Jews to identify with our movement. So we're going to use Jewish symbols, phrases that are familiar, concepts that are precious, and we're just going to twist them a bit.
Yeah. You know what's interesting that on this specific topic, you refer to one of the Zionists in your book who actually recommended the land of Palestine over other lands for the reason that Jews could change their socioeconomic status there. You say, for example, Jews who immigrated to America tended to remain in the same types of jobs that they had in Europe. Jews in Russia were not involved in farming or agriculture, for example. If the Jews would collectively move to Palestine, they could develop it into a comprehensive social and economic community where Jews could normalize not only their lifestyles, but also their occupations. So there was this notion that it was also not only for religious reasons, but there was this idea that Palestine would make sense from an economic perspective.
It wasn't for religious reasons at all. They wanted the Jews to get together and start a new economy wherever it was. You know, Herzl wanted, actually the Orthodox Jews, there was a small amount of Orthodox Jews, very misguided, who thought mistakenly that they could kind of exploit the Zionists, that the Zionists will help find a place where the Jews can go where there won't be any anti-Semitism, and as far as ideology and Jewish identity, the rabbis will take care of that. The Zionists presented themselves to many Jews as simply wanting a practical solution to anti-Semitism. That was propaganda. And the rabbis actually said, we don't need the Holy Land, let's take Uganda, because Rabbi Reines was their leader, that was his name. He said, because if we're just looking for a safe place, why do we have to have the Holy Land? And Herzl, who was anti-religious, he didn't like religious Jews. He said, no, we need the Holy Land because marketing purposes. We want the Jews to feel a sense of being Jewish, but not as a religion, as a nationality. We want them to have a sense of this is a familiar place, the place they've always longed for, but not as a messianic renewal of the world, as a national homeland. You see, artificial Jewish flavoring and artificial Jewish coloring, that's what they did. So it's like taking, I don't know, an apricot-flavored Jelly Belly and trying to get nutrition from it and serving it to these people that eat apricots and say, look, we got this new apricot for you. It was bait. It was a generations and generations of, it was brainwashing. Now, different Zionists had different ideas. Ben-Gurion said the Jews don't have a definition. And Herzl, when they asked Herzl, it was a British committee, what Jewish nationalism is, he said, well, you know what a nation is? A nation is a recognizable, cohesive group of people held together by a common enemy. And they asked Herzl, who's the common enemy to the Jews? And he said, the anti-Semites, meaning. And he wrote in his book, The Jewish State, that we are forced to be a nation. Distress, meaning anti-Semitism, binds us together. According to Herzl, whoever the anti-Semites hate, they're Jewish. So remember I told you I asked an anti-Semite once, who do you hate? And he says, well, whoever identifies as a Jew. So now you go over to Herzl and you say, okay, no problem. Why do you identify as a Jew? He says, because these anti-Semites hate me.
Okay, so it's very circular.
I'm trying to get time off and nobody will approve it type of situation.
You don't even know who your employer is or what you're taking time off from. They don't even know what it is to be Jewish. They can't define it because there is, and their plan was, and it still is, and I'll show you how even the last few years, even past 5 years since I wrote that book, they've been progressing along this trajectory of trying to make the Jews forget all of these questions that I'm asking and identify as Israeli nationals. I'm not Israeli, I'm not Palestinian. I'm an American who by religion practices Judaism. I have no more connection with it than my neighbor on this side who's Christian, my neighbor on that side who's actually Muslim. And I even those Jews that side with the Palestinians, right? They do so because they feel we're Jews and therefore we must speak about it. I say that whether those Jews are JVP or whether those Jews are Orthodox Jews that do this, or whether they're the left wing. So if they're doing it because they're Jews and they feel that as Jews they need to object to what Israel's doing, my question is, why do you feel that because you're Jewish you must object to what Israel's doing any more than you feel you must object to what Ukraine is doing or Russia or China is doing? So you see, all of these groups, if somebody wants to say, you know what, I'm a human rights activist, I want to get involved in this particular issue, no problem. But if somebody says, I'm Jewish, and because I'm Jewish, I feel an obligation to object to what Israel does, I say that that person just enforced Zionism to an extent, whether he means to or not.
So you say to Jewish people who feel that they need to get involved in speaking out on behalf of Israel's aggression against Palestinians, and you say why? And I would say, I'm sure many of them have told you that it's because of the identity theft aspect.
Fine.
They feel this need because these people are masquerading as Jewish people and telling all the world, we're the real Jews.
Zelensky is just